The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, and CGSP's Africa editor, Geronima in Mauritius. A very good evening to the both of you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Well, at the time that we are recording this, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has wrapped up his week-long visit to Africa, the first portion of his first overseas annual trip that always begins in Africa, at least for the past 34 years. I know there's several of you have written to me that on two occasions, a Chinese foreign minister did not stop in Africa first. Qin Gang last year made a brief stopover in Bangladesh, but for our purposes of this discussion, 34 years is a pretty impressive record. Wang Yi kept it up this year. And he finished his discussions in Côte d'Ivoire on Thursday, where he met the president, Alassane Ouattara. And the headline of that meeting, which was very interesting, that came out of it, and this is, gentlemen, what I want to get your take on, was this is the Xinhua headline here. The president of Côte d'Ivoire reaffirms the one China principle. And that speaks to that this trip this year was very different than the previous trips. It was extremely low profile. He was in Lomé, Togo, where he met with Prime Minister Victoire Tomega Dogbe and also with Foreign Minister Robert Ducy. And then also in Tunisia, he met with President Kais Saied. And then in Egypt, where he started the trip on Sunday and Monday, that stage had quite a bit of news. He met with President al-Sisi. There was a lot of talk about the situation in the Red Sea. There was a lot of discussion about the Mideast war in Gaza. But after that trip, no public events, no signings, no high-profile media coverage. It was a very, very low-key tour, very much in contrast to some of the previous trips by Wang Yi himself and other Chinese foreign ministers. Cobus, let's get your first take, and then I'd like to get Géraud's as well on your assessment looking back on this trip and what were some of the key takeaways.
It seemed interesting to me that how much other external non-African kind of foreign policy issues for China kind of weighed over the trip. So on the one hand, obviously being in Egypt took him to right next to the Israel crisis, and he was calling for a Gaza peace conference while he was there. You know, kind of a lot of the Egypt trip was taken up by Middle East politics rather than by African politics. So that was interesting, but then also, a lot of it was taken over by Taiwan. There was all of these kind of calling on African leaders to reaffirm the one China principle, you know, and the general kind of like noise within China around the Taiwan elections made it an interesting moment. You know, kind of this kind of anxiety about how the election went in Taiwan was clearly kind of hanging over all of the other foreign policy kind of pronouncements as well. So it was interesting to see that in action, I thought.
And Géraud, in previous visits, and I remember back a couple of years ago when Wang went to Tanzania, he signed a contract to build the SGR Railway. This was an EPC contract, an engineering contract. There were, again, these high-profile events, but in Tunisia, in Lomé, and then also in Abidjan, nothing. No media coverage either, and even the local media was rather subdued. Did that take you by surprise?
I think that we are so much used to it having Chinese signing big contracts that we're not really used to those simple diplomatic trips of Chinese foreign ministers that do not come with huge and big announcements. And for me, it did not really surprise me in a way that I do believe that China is at this space right now in Africa where it just wants to maintain a certain position. And during this trip, I think it was more of a diplomatic protocol trip more than anything. I think the stop that was more important was the one in Egypt, but beyond that, it was much more diplomatic, to maintain diplomatic relation, to extend Chinese presence, and to see in a certain way how to maintain that position. And I do believe that the Taiwan occurrence during this trip was much more incidental, because if I'm not mistaken, those trips to those African countries maybe were scheduled ahead, so the calendars, the time were known beforehand. So during this trip, it was also an opportunity for Wang Yi to kind of, garner much more support from those African countries. And it was really interesting. Taiwan came back in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Togo, and in Cote d'Ivoire. I kind of wonder if all those countries concerted themselves, or one copied the other in terms of the statement to make, or the Chinese embassy in those countries kind of let them know that we'd appreciate if you could, at a certain extent, reaffirm your position to the one China policy. But as you were saying in the beginning, this trip has much more diplomatic value, maintaining this kind of tradition for 34 years. I mean, there's no country on earth that can really use that and say, I've done that to Africa. And for that, China deserve a kind of applause for that.
So just a little bit of background on this Taiwan issue that both Cobus and Géraud have mentioned. And again, it's not an issue that is unique to Africa. The Chinese mounted a global campaign to get countries around the world to reaffirm what they call the One China principle, or the One China policy. And this came in response to the election of Democratic Progressive Party candidate Lai Ching-te on Saturday. And he is from the party that is the incumbent party, and they're the Green Party in Taiwan, that is most opposed to China. And that's why it really sparked a rather strenuous reaction from the Chinese foreign policy establishment, including the media as well, is that they wanted countries to line up on their side in this issue with Taiwan. And because the United States issued these congratulatory messages, and none more so than Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who on X posted a very, very hearty and warm congratulation to Lai Ching-te, that really antagonized the Chinese. So there was this effort by the Chinese to get everybody around the world to line up on the One China policy. And I think, Géraud, to your point, this was not coincidental that Xinhua focused on this in Togo and Cote d'Ivoire. It is because I think there was a concerted message from the embassy saying, fall in line. And I have a feeling that Wang himself made this a priority to speak to these issues on that. One of the mysteries of this tour, though, Cobus, and we've been looking at this all week, is why did he choose these particular countries to go to? Now, Géraud brings up, I think, the excellent point is that sometimes diplomacy is really not a very glamorous, field of work. And you have to do the nuts and bolts, meet people, shake some hands, and just hang out a little bit together without any big announcements, without any fanfare. This is a very important part of diplomacy. And maybe that's what this trip was all about. Our China editor, Che Yuan, he went out and looked across the Chinese media for some clues. You've been looking for some clues about what may have gone into the decision to choose Tunisia, Togo, and Ivory Coast, because none of these three countries have very important strategic considerations for the Chinese. They're not large trading partners. They're not strategically located in one sense, not like Djibouti, for example. They do not have large loans. They do not have large infrastructure projects in any meaningful way relative to other African countries. So again, it was really just why did they choose this? And you wrote about this in Thursday's edition of the newsletter. What did you find out working with Che Yuan on the Chinese side and your own research into what may have gone into the decision to choose this particular itinerary?
We concentrated on some of the broad issues, the broad realities of these countries. And, taking into account that in the first place, obviously, this is always a mystery. Every year they announce a bunch of countries, and every year there's people like us going but why? So, that is just kind of par for the course.
But sometimes the Kenya's obvious. Ethiopia, obvious. These are very important big countries in Africa. They're strategically important. They're frontline great powers, competition states. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, South Africa being another example.
Yes, I mean, there's 4 or 5 countries in Africa where, kind of that constitute the kind of big 5, right? And then all of the other 50 plus countries then don't constitute those, that short list. But I think what was very notable for us was the kind of Atlantic focus and the West and North African focus. What I think was what also united these countries were that they, except for Egypt, well, no, Egypt too actually, that they all have different kinds of shorter and longer kind of experiences with French colonialism at a moment when French colonial legacy is looming particularly large, particularly in West Africa around the Sahel, and where anti-French sentiment is very strong. So it is interesting that Tunisia had a big spat with Europe and particularly with France late last year, where they actually returned several million euros of aid, after a fight around migration issues. And the 2 West African countries are literally across the border from the Sahel. They both share borders with Burkina Faso. So it's right in there where, in the part of Africa where anti-French sentiment is the strongest at the moment. And it may well have been, or, kind of one of my guesses was that it's a kind of a strike the iron while it's hot situation for Wang, kind of in going there at a moment where where France's foothold there seems to be slipping, maybe reflects a kind of a moment to take advantage of this kind of opportunity for China. At the same time, the fact that visit happened without any major announcements tends to weaken that theory a little bit. Another factor that we looked at was simply Belt and Road and logistical expansion. Obviously, they're all very strategically located. And this kind of location, particularly on the Gulf of Guinea, kind of raises the question of possible greater Chinese involvement there. One should keep in mind that one of the reasons for China's base in Djibouti was its anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. Similar piracy problems are now popping up on the Gulf of Guinea side, and kind of which is another one of these kind of like interesting talking points, but there's no real indication that China is interested in doing any kind of anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Guinea, for example. These are all kind of interesting kind of data points that we ended up raising, but they don't necessarily come that much closer in providing a kind of conclusive answer.
And they also don't neatly align with one another to make these any cogent theories that may play out. Géraud, you follow the Francophone press quite a bit. What I thought was very interesting looking at French media coverage of Wang's tour in Ivory Coast and Tunisia and also in Togo was the fact that they never mentioned any of the issues about declining French influence that Cobus mentioned. It's very interesting how selective the coverage is in France. Did you find any clues about why he may have chosen those countries from looking at the French language media in West Africa?
There's really not a big of a surprise that the French influence was not mentioned into those during this trip, because when you look at it, the country that he visited in West Africa, Côte d'Ivoire and Togo, still remain basically more strong, still aligned to Paris. You don't have a strong anti-French sentiment coming from Côte d'Ivoire, coming from Togo. They're basically would say in the French backyard. So I think that's why, for me, it did not pop up during this trip, because there was really no way to kind of align that feeling of anti-French sentiment in Côte d'Ivoire and Togo with Wang's visit in those 2 countries. In the case of Côte d'Ivoire, it's also worth mentioning that China has quite significant investment in Côte d'Ivoire. For those who are following football, there is the African Cup of Nations in Côte d'Ivoire. Few stadiums have been built by China, financed and built by China. You have the port expansion in Abidjan that was done by Chinese companies and Chinese infrastructure. And last week, they inaugurated a bridge in Abidjan that was financed and built by China. So you do have a lot of quite big Chinese infrastructure that was happening around this time in Côte d'Ivoire. So when Wang Yi arrived there, it was an opportunity for him to remind that, in terms of soft power, in terms of presence, that Côte d'Ivoire, China has been doing a lot of things there. And an interesting part as well that China has been doing in Côte d'Ivoire that maybe did not really pay attention in terms of commodities, but in terms of it's the cocoa commodities that where China is currently financing a processing plant of cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, the first one in the country. Soon they're going to process cocoa and to produce chocolate. So you kind of have that China's presence and influence in Côte d'Ivoire that I think that for me in the West Africa, Côte d'Ivoire being an economic powerhouse, that trip kind of in a certain way made sense in a certain way.
And also, let's not forget that Abidjan is the headquarters of the African Development Bank. The Chinese have a $2 billion loan facility that was started back in 2014, and it's between 2014 and 2024. It's the Africa Growing Together Fund. It'll be interesting to see if that fund gets renewed. And now that the 10-year program of that is over. Also on the cocoa side, very interesting that you brought that up, Giraud, because China also has a cocoa exchange that was launched with Ghana last year or 2 years ago, I think, in Changsha and in Hunan province. So interesting dynamics there. Nothing on the Côte d'Ivoire side of that, but it would be interesting to see if they could build a Chinese cocoa exchange that would then put China much more into the cocoa market. And China being, of course, one of the largest consumers of chocolate in the world. And there was some anxiety in Ivory Coast a couple of years ago. Some of you may remember that in Hainan province on Hainan Island, they started to grow some cocoa. And everybody was like, oh no, here we go. The Chinese are going to take over again. No, it doesn't look like the Chinese are going to grow cocoa in any large numbers. But on the tropical island of Hainan, they are starting to grow a little bit of it. Okay, before we move on to our discussion today about Chinese military issues and weapons procurement in West Africa in particular, let's just get a closing reflection from each of you on the Wang Yi tour. He goes off to Jamaica and Brazil next. We'll talk about that in our Global South show. But for now, when you look back on this tour, what's your big takeaway? Giraud, we'll go to you first, and then Cobus, you'll get the last word.
My big takeaway is, just like I said in the beginning, the consistency of this China's trip in Africa is something to applaud in a way that when you see how many big powers haven't been that much consistent toward Africa, seeing China being doing that for 34 years, though people can mention the two trips, even last year, Chingang, I do consider Africa was still the first trip, because the one in Bangladesh was just a stop at the airport. So
he never left the airport. So I don't think that's technically a trip.
Exactly. So yeah, for me, that's consistent is something really to pay attention for. So we don't, and it's also the fact that we didn't have big announcement. It also may indicate the way for us to look Chinese diplomacy in Africa in a simple of for just the purpose of diplomacy, doing the work, visiting and talking to countries. I think a few weeks from now, we're going to have Blinken going to Africa, and Côte d'Ivoire is also on the list of Blinken's trip to Africa. So it's going to be interesting to look what's going to happen there.
I think for me, there's 2 points. One is that obviously this trip fits into the larger work of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit or ministerial meeting that's happening later this year. And I assume that the kind of work that Wang did, is fitting into that kind of larger process. So in some ways, it makes sense that it's a little bit lower key because it's building the foundation for a much splashier kind of event, Africa-focused event later this year. So, let's see if that is true. The other point for me, I think, is what's interesting is the Atlantic focus of the trip. Not only being that all of the stops or many of the stops kind of concentrated on the Atlantic side with no Indian Ocean visits this time, but then also going on to Brazil afterwards. It's like being on both sides of the Atlantic and kind of drawing what is now not only this kind of reiterating this historical connection between Africa and Brazil, but also putting that into the context of BRICS, with Egypt having joined recently. So those are, again, kind of like it's almost impossible to say how important those are, but they struck me this time.
Well, one aspect of Chinese engagement in West Africa in particular, but elsewhere on the continent over the past year, and this is an issue that at least did not come up publicly and most likely did not come up privately in Wang's visit, is the question of Chinese arms sales that seem to be taking off in many parts of the continent. Looking specifically at Nigeria and even where you come from, Giraud, in DRC, the new use of Chinese-made CH-4 Rainbow drones. These are very powerful attack drones. We're seeing lots of sales in Zimbabwe and also in Nigeria as well of armored personnel carriers, frigates. A wide range of military equipment is now being marketed. Cobus, we covered last week, I think it was, that the Chinese are trying to sell now their big troop transport carrier. This is like a C-5 in the United States or the C-131. These are these big troop carriers, these cargo planes. The Y-20 they're trying to sell to the Nigerians. Cobus, when we talk about weapons sales, oftentimes the Chinese come up for small arms. These are the AK-47s that have been very popular in many parts of the continent, small landmines, these very, again, very what I call personal weapons, if you will. Now it seems like the Chinese are moving more into weapons systems, and the Chinese are finding a lot of eager buyers in Africa because, much like a lot of Chinese products, they come in cheaper and with fewer restrictions than European and American arms vendors does. Tobis, when you look out onto the arms landscape in Africa today, it seems like this is a growing market given the increased numbers of conflicts and instability in many parts of the continent now.
Yes. So as you say, this is a moment of more instability in Africa. And I assume that this is partly also driving or like fear of instability or fear of coups, particularly, at a moment when there's a wave of coups moving across the continent, may well also be motivating governments to prioritize arms buying. I think the other issue is that Russia is so preoccupied with the war in Ukraine. Russia was traditionally one of Africa's largest arms suppliers. I think it was officially the largest arms supplier for a long time. And I think, now that obviously Russia is using a lot of those arms itself now, so that has affected the availability of arms available to African countries not facing restrictions and at this price point. So I think China is to a certain extent increasing its share by stepping into a gap that was left by Russia.
Giraud, the perception from the West is that Chinese arms sales in Africa are destabilizing. And of course, it's ironic because the West is also selling weapons into Africa as well. But they see, in many respects, the United States and Europeans see the introduction of these drones and also many of the cyber weapon systems that the Chinese are bringing in, and even these troop transports as potentially stabilizing. In the Congo, for example, there's been a widespread use of Chinese military equipment, particularly those CH-4 drones. What is the viewpoint that you see in terms of African governments and their choice of arms vendors?
You mentioned those factors. You have the cost factor and you also have the regulation factor, because acquiring Chinese weapons seems to be much more easier, much more affordable in terms of regulation and access compared to Western vendors. And the fact also China is in terms of foreign policy doesn't really go with that approach of like non-interference. For them, it's much more commercial deals than anything else. So they will be selling arms and weapons to Africa just like they'll be selling, any kind of commodities. So as long as African government pay and they're willing to put money on the table, Chinese will always keep on selling those weapons in Africa. And let's not forget the military cooperation that many African countries do have with Chinese army, with the Chinese PLA. So you do have that conjunction of dynamics that's happening on the ground that explain why you're going to have much more Chinese weapons coming into Africa. But except that, just to react also to what Cobus said, when you take the Russia factor inside, it reminds me that research. There was a report that was published last year by the Stockholm International Research Institute that was surprisingly saying that Russia even became the first arms supplier to Africa compared to China. And they published that interesting table where you compare Russia weapons to China weapons. So it was really interesting to see how many African countries do really regularly buy weapons from Africa. And just to tell you how much Chinese weapons seems to be really interested in Africa, we have Norenko, who opened a new office in, I think it was in Senegal. So just to tell you how much African market seems to be much more interesting to China. And since we mentioned Cote d'Ivoire earlier, yes, Cote d'Ivoire last year, I think in October, acquired an unspecified amount of Chinese automatic armed cars from China, so from Norenko and from the PLA. Just to tell you how much Chinese weapons have been quite widespread now in Africa, much more welcome and, much more affordable for many African governments.
So I noticed that the announcements in the news about Chinese weapon sales in Africa just started to pick up pace a lot. One of the sites that I follow very closely to keep track of this is Military Africa. It's based out of Nigeria, and they do a fantastic job in terms of tracking African military news. It's again, a very specialized blog and site, much like our own here. And so I thought I would reach out to the director there, Ikeni Lionel, who's an award-winning military affairs writer based in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, to ask him about the trends in Chinese weapon sales and to give us a different perspective and really get a better understanding of what's going on. So let's take a listen now to my discussion with Ikeni Lionel. Ekene Lionel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's great to finally have the chance to speak with you.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to be here.
You know, Ekene, I have been wanting to speak with you for a long time because I've been following your site at Military Africa for many years now. And one of the things that I've noticed in the past several months is there seems to be an uptick in terms of Chinese military engagement on the continent, particularly in the weapons procurement side of things. You just recently ran an article entitled China Seeks to Establish Presence in Nigeria's Defense Sector, and that highlights the growing popularity of Chinese weapons in Nigeria, from drones to patrol ships to armored personnel carriers to Air Force jets. Talk to us a little bit about the trends that you're covering and seeing from your vantage point at Military Africa in terms of the popularity of Chinese military hardware, both in Nigeria, but Africa more broadly.
Oh, thank you, Eric. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to, participate in this podcast. Over the years, Chinese arms manufacturers have made significant inroads in Africa. Since 2016 to 2020 period, China is the biggest or was the biggest arms supplier to sub-Saharan Africa, just behind Russia. China supplied about 22% of all the arms in sub-Saharan Africa, while Russia supplied 24% and the United States just 5%. A lot of African countries, basically almost all African sub-Saharan African countries acquire weapons from China. Chinese companies have supplied weapon systems ranging from small arms, artillery, armored vehicles, drones, fighter jets, and even warships to African countries. So for China, Africa is one of the important region for China, as there's power competition amongst foreign powers. Africa is definitely a growing market for Chinese arms.
What is it that you think that African countries like about the Chinese arms? Is it just the price? Is it the fact that they can get more technology with fewer restrictions? Because buying from the Americans, for example, oftentimes comes with a lot of guidelines, restrictions, regulations, but the Chinese may not have as much. What are some of the appeals for African countries to purchase weapons from the Chinese?
You're very correct. Chinese arms export to Africa has been successful basically for two major reasons. Number one, as you mentioned, they are very affordable compared to Western or Russian equivalents. Considering that a lot of African countries cannot afford overly expensive equipment to fight their wars, that's the number one major reason. Secondly, as you also mentioned, Chinese equipment are sold without strings attached, unlike Western arms deal that tells you, okay, how you employ these weapon systems and who you're to use it against, as well as several human rights issues they usually focuses on. For example, the recent Super Tucano the United States and Brazil sold to Nigeria, we found out that the United States said they couldn't use this Super Tucano light attack fighter jets against fighter aircraft against bandits, which are one of these major security challenges Nigeria is facing. But on the other hand, Nigeria acquired several Wingloom 2 drones, CH-4 drones, and CH-3 Rainbow drones from China. And this drone system has been continuously used against these bandits. They have been carrying out airstrikes against the same group that the Nigerian Air Force wouldn't want to use the Super Tucanos with. So these are the two major reasons why Chinese equipment are favorable to African militaries. Number one, as I said, the African militaries aren't really that rich enough to acquire high-end or super expensive equipment. So they rely on China and to some extent Russia to supply most of this equipment to satisfy their requirements.
And what do you hear about the quality of this equipment? So it's more affordable, but is it as good? Does it break down? Is it reliable?
Considering the region we are in, we have to balance when we get reports like use of equipment and serviceability issues, and we have to balance it against if it's a propaganda or if it's actually genuine information. In Africa, we have several conflicting reports at all the time from the Western and from Chinese. The Western tell us that Chinese are manipulative. They supply substandard equipment. They try to use their equipment and loans and as a sort of political tool. But then, besides that, we've gotten several reports that some of these Chinese armored vehicles, some of them are kind of defective. For example, around 2018 to 2020, we got a report that Gabon were complaining that some of their armored vehicles they bought from China was having severe technical issues. But most of these are unconfirmed. The reports are usually unconfirmed, and then so we just have to balance most of these reports critically, see if they're actually genuine or just propaganda.
Yeah, especially in Nigeria, where there's a lot of Chinese equipment in use both in the Nigerian Air Force, but also on ground forces as well. Have you heard reports of quality issues, or is that something, again, that's more, as you're suggesting, coming out of the Western media and not as prominent coming from African sources?
Well, Nigeria has acquired quite a number of equipment from China. We have warships, we have artillery, we've acquired drones, and a plethora of armored personnel carriers. So far, we haven't really had significant information that these are defective in any way. I think Nigeria has been satisfied with most of this equipment. Contrarily, Nigeria has actually complained about not getting spare parts from mostly Western equipment, and the Chinese equipment have so far been performing outstandingly. For example, the MRAP, the Bigfoot MRAP, Nigeria acquired quite a number of it. The soldiers on the ground are actually praising it, that it has saved quite a number of lives. The VT4 tanks, which Nigeria acquired in 2021-2022, most of these tanks have been in the forefront of the fight against counterterrorism in the country. They've actually performed splendidly compared to Russia T-72 that we acquired a while ago. The T-72s now are mostly unserviceable due to lack of spare parts, but the VT4 Chinese VT4s are performing very well.
Those T-72 tanks you can see on the battlefield in Ukraine quite a bit. They look quite old, but they're still working quite well. And the MRAPs that Ekene was talking about, those are those big armored personnel carriers that a lot of folks use, both in the U.S. and also in Africa as well. But those troop transports are very important, particularly in northern Nigeria, where troops are facing off against Boko Haram. So that's very interesting to see those in action. You mentioned earlier about the Winglong 2 drones. Those are the CH-4 Rainbow drones. Those have been quite popular in Africa now. They're in action right now in Nigeria, Morocco, the DRC. They were also spotted in conflicts in both Libya and in Ethiopia during the Tigray conflict. Those were brought in from the UAE, as best as we can tell. Talk to us a little bit about the introduction of drone warfare in Africa and the growing prominence of the use of drones. The Nigerian Air Force is really, relying on them heavily to fight the Boko Haram militants in the north. In the Congo, they've been deployed to the eastern Congo to fight in the war there. Tell us a little bit about the trends in the drone warfare space.
Well, Africa has acquired quite a number of drones from Turkey, the Bayraktar drone, the Ankara drones, and then from China, the Winglong CH-4 and CH-3 drone. For Nigeria started the use of drone in 2015. They acquired the CH-3 Rainbow drone, about 5 of them, which we wouldn't have known about it if one wasn't lost due to probably technical malfunction or some other issues. So far since then, Nigeria has acquired a plethora of drones. Nigeria is one of the leading drone users in Africa. We are doing a report on all the drones acquired by African countries since 1980. According to our report, Nigeria has one of the most drones, followed by Egypt and then Ethiopia. Regarding drone warfare, well, mass usage of drones started in Libya. During the Libyan civil war, we have two factions, the government of National Accord and the Libyan National Army, using drones from different sides of the world. It showcased one of the massive use of drones ever seen across the world. Africa is slowly adopting the drone warfare approach. They are using drones for a plethora of reasons, from surveillance to precision strike, as well as reconnaissance, and whatever drones can do. Africans are slowly but surely adopting drones, integrating drone warfare into the fabric of their military architecture and their warfighting all. But yeah, Africa, it's actually a good thing that Africa is using drones right now because it saves a lot of resources. You know the benefits of using drones, and Africa is at the forefront of use of this equipment.
Now, in Libya, the drones were operated by the UAE, as far as I've read, as well as in Ethiopia. In the DRC, the CH-4s are being operated by a Romanian crew. It raises the question in terms of the capacity of African militaries to operate their own equipment. Do you have any sense in terms of the skills that are needed to operate these new technologies and whether or not the Nigerian Air Force and other air forces are being well trained in order to use drones and other high-tech equipment?
Well, when you acquire a drone, when the drone is being acquired by military forces, during the negotiation parts, it's usually very likely that training as well as supply of spare parts will be part of the business deal. So I really don't see big issue in African militaries deploying, using, maintaining these drone systems. Unlike fighter jets, which requires a vast amount of resources to keep them airborne, to keep them going and to keep them fighting, drones require less commitment. Yeah, African countries can actually operate these drones as they have been doing for quite a number of years. Nigeria doesn't have issues with drone, although incidents like friendly fire had occurred across the continent, particularly in Nigeria. But then these are things that in warfare, these things happen.
That happens everywhere, right? I mean, that's just part of warfare. Yeah.
Yeah, it happens everywhere. Yeah, that's just part of warfare. Exactly.
You also have been writing quite a bit lately about the donations of Chinese military equipment to various African countries. In Ghana, you said that the Chinese defense contractor Polytechnologies donated a rocket artillery system to the Ghanaian armed forces. Also, Zimbabwe took a donation of a large shipment of military hardware that included armored vehicles, guns, and various other equipment. What about these donations? Is that part of military aid? Is it part of trying to sell equipment? What is the strategy of these donations that you're covering?
Well, from an expert view, Chinese donations as well as Chinese sales of military equipment doesn't particularly follow a strategy, economic strategy. Over the years, China has increased its development, economic, and security support to Africa. Of course, China is now the largest financier of infrastructural projects in the African continent and has played and has a major role to play in the economic and security outlook of the region. China is portraying itself as with a mantra of non-interference as well as respecting the sovereignty of most of these African countries. So basically, China is offering itself as a friend to African countries. So these donations comes more or less as a way to further its influence in the region, but as a way to portray itself as a friend of African countries and as a way of supporting their security architecture, as well as making sure these countries are safe and secure. So China isn't really giving these gifts out as a way of furthering its influence per se, although that's the strategic goal. But definitely all it's trying to do is to showcase itself as a friend of African countries.
Yeah. And when you look ahead for 2024, it's already been a busy year in China-Africa military relations based on your coverage. What are you forecasting for the rest of the year? What are some of the trends that you think people should keep an eye on in terms of military-to-military ties?
Well, the sales of military equipment, number one, it's going to increase. A lot of African countries depend mainly on China for some of its military equipment. Looking at Southern African countries besides South Africa, majority of them depends largely on China to maintain its military posture. In the year 2024, there are a lot of opportunities, especially with the upcoming China-African Cooperation Forum in Beijing later this year. There will be a lot of opportunities for Chinese venture capital to invest in Africa, and also Chinese companies to sell some of their equipment to African country. So definitely 2024 is going to be a busy year for both the relationship between China and Africa.
Ekene Lionel is an award-winning military affairs writer based in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, where he's also the director of the defense and security news website Military Africa. Ekene, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to shed some light on this very important topic and one that you've been covering just so fantastically. If people want to follow Military Africa, where can they find you guys?
We are on social media on all platforms, www.military.africa, then you get to meet us.
Fantastic. I'll put links to their site and also their social platforms in the show notes. Ekene, thank you so much again. Really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric. It was nice to be here.
Jim, what I found so interesting about the discussion with Ekene is how the discussions about military affairs seem to parallel the discussions in the West about Chinese engagement in Africa in consumer, in aid, in debt, and so many other ways, where there is a real divergence in how U.S. and European media cover Chinese military affairs in Africa and how Africans like Ekene see it. So again, the narrative we hear in the U.S. is that Chinese equipment sucks, it breaks down, is cheap, there's a reason why it's low cost, don't buy it. Made in China, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what we're hearing from Ekene. He's saying that it's performing well and people seem to like it.
Yeah, that's quite obvious because I'd go with the reasoning if it was not performing well, they wouldn't keep on buying them. Even though we can assume there are corruption behind, there are, kickbacks behind, but that's beside the point. But the reality, if those equipment were not good enough, those army wouldn't keep on buying them, especially those who are facing real terror threat like Nigeria, DRC, or Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, any Burkina Faso, any other country who are buying them. So the fact that they keep on buying them, countries like Ethiopia who went to war with those equipment. So no, I think they're performing well, and the perspective is just quite different because at some point, as Ekene said, you're going to find yourself in the middle of a propaganda war where they say Chinese equipment are not good, they are bad. But from the African perspective, it will be different. Are they performing as well as American last military equipment or, the state-of-the-art equipment? I don't think so, but they do perform well enough and good enough for Africa to keep on buying them. We know that China is going to keep on improving his system, his weapon system. So we can expect that Africa is going to keep on buying them. And as long as there's no restriction into exporting those weapons, yes, Africa will still go looking at China. They're going to move a bit from East European countries to China, which is more state actors with much more resources.
Yeah, that's a great point because if the equipment wasn't working, the marketplace to buy weapons is huge. So there's no loyalty to buying Chinese equipment if it doesn't work.
Exactly.
I mean, they can go get Russian, they can get Turkish, they can get Indian. I mean, everybody's selling weapons. That's a fantastic point. Cobus, on this question of, again, the parallels between weapon sales and other aspects of foreign engagement into Africa, I think there's some interesting comparisons that can be made to the development sector where, again, the West comes in and says the Chinese, they don't have any standards, they don't have any rules and regulations, they don't do ESG compliance. These are all the criticisms coming from U.S. and European stakeholders, and Indian as well. And then, in turn, the Americans will say, we have all these governance rules in terms of our development and things like that. Now, the same can be said in the weapons sector. So the reason why the Americans don't sell advanced weapon systems to many African governments is because they don't meet their human rights and their governance standards. So the concern is that they will fall into the wrong hands or be used in the wrong ways. The Chinese come in and say, if your dollars are green, we'll do it. We'll take it. Let's do a deal. No strings attached. That seems to be the parallel in terms of how the Chinese approach development, which is let's just get it done, and how the West approaches development. And apparently in weapon sales, it's the same way. Do you see that same comparison? Or am I just kind of reading too much into this?
I do see parallels. I don't think only in those two fields, but like there are these kind of cross-cutting kind of dynamics. I think in lots of ways, in many fields, and this is, for example, like data network provision as well, is a similar thing where the Chinese are quite agnostic, about how these data networks are going to be used, whether they want some kind of centralized government-controlled network or a free marketized network. Like research has shown that Chinese companies are willing to build any of those as long as you're willing to pay. That, in weapons and data, in development and so on, that contrasts with the Western approach, which, as you say, does have a lot more kind of oversight, a lot more kind of hoops in relation to whether the people who are buying these systems are good actors or not. But what it also feeds into is situating Western institutions as the arbiters of what good use is or what bad use is, and in general kind of like positioning Western governments and Western institutions as tracking kind of human rights abuses, punishing them, sanctioning governments or not, right? So that's an interesting difference for me, because the Chinese, kind of for all of the ways that the Chinese have ambitions to reshape the world system, they don't seem particularly interested in fulfilling that role and in stepping into that kind of overseeing role, kind of, and I think Western actors tend to think of that role as their kind of natural domain, and for some good reasons, including that they have some of the kind of investigation apparatuses set up to keep track of all of these things. So that is an interesting tension for me, and I think one of the questions is how long the West will be able to maintain that position, particularly because obviously they need buy-in from all of these other non-Western governments to stay in that spot. So, kind of whether there's going to be more and more pushback from Global South governments around that kind of overseeing mechanism is something that I wonder about over the medium term.
And Giraud, I'm going to give you the last word today. When you hear all about the weapons sales, and you see what's happening in the Congo and the Nigerians buying and Zimbabwean gifts and so forth, are you worried about more Chinese weapons sales in Africa, or do you think it's actually a good thing because it provides African countries many of the same tools that other countries have? What's your gut feeling on whether this is a positive or a negative trend?
I think it's a positive trend, especially when I know that African countries are not buying weapons from East European countries anymore. They're buying from a state factory. It's a good thing. I don't know why African countries that are facing serious security threat and issues and challenge, they are constrained by regulation than Western countries are not willing to break to sell them weapons. So no, for me, it's a very good thing for Africa. And I would encourage them to keep on buying weapons from China. It's going to at least help them to fill the security gap they have in terms of weapon, in terms of equipment, in the security challenge they have to face. So yes, for me, it's a good thing on the longer run.
So you don't buy the American argument that selling weapons to countries with poor human rights standards and lack of transparency and non-democratic countries is a bad thing?
I'd like to ask, I wonder who's selling Saudi Arabia and Egypt weapons?
Okay, point well taken. Let's leave the conversation there. This was fascinating to dive into weapons sales. It's been a long time since we've talked about this, but it shows another facet of the China-Africa relationship. And I think, as Giraud pointed out, we're past the days now of the big deals, the big infrastructure deals, the contracts and things like that. So to better understand the nuances of this incredibly complex relationship, you have to look at different aspects of it, like weapons. And they do provide some insights into how this relationship is evolving. Everything, of course, is leading up to FOCAC, as we talked about in the Wang Yi visit, and Cobus talked about as well. It's going to happen sometime in the fall, around November. Cobus is working on right now a brief that will come out maybe in the spring that starts to lay out a preview of what to expect in FOCAC. But one thing we do know for sure is that this year's FOCAC is probably going to be very different. Actually, I just contradicted myself. For sure and probably. I'm almost certain that this FOCAC is going to be very different than previous ones. That the days of the big money announcements, the big loans, those are all over, and the relationship has changed. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next 10 months, is trying to kind of put some pieces together in this puzzle to figure out where we're going. I mean, this relationship is very different in 2024 than it was in 2020 and 2016 and certainly 2010. So in order to understand it, you have to kind of get into the details of it like we did with the Kene. So thank you both for your time today and for your insights on all these diplomatic and military issues. If you enjoyed the insights that Giraud and Cobus brought today, then your support of our work would be greatly appreciated, and you would benefit enormously from their analysis every day that the team puts together at the China Global South Project, agenda-free, independent, nonpartisan news. It is something that is a rarity in today's world, but something that we're desperately trying to do around China to provide policymakers, decision makers, scholars, and listeners like you with just an unvarnished view that, again, is agenda-free. So if you'd like to support the work we're doing, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe and sign up for a free 30-day trial of our service. Subscriptions are just $199 a year, $19 a month. And if you are a student, email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you a link for half off, $10 a month or $99 a year. So super affordable for the great work that these guys are doing. So thank you again, both. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Giraud, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.